I'd love for you to join me May 19th at 7 p.m. Central Standard Time, where we're going to answer your questions live on how to rock retirement in this age of inflation and everything else going on, as well as talk about the open enrollment period for the Rock Retirement Club. You can learn more and register at livewithroger.com. Did you know that there are bees that are solo? Or that learning to play the harmonica is like learning a whole new language? It is simply incredible. Well, hey there. Welcome to the Retirement Answer Man Show. This is Roger Whitney. I am your host. Oh, I promised I wouldn't sing on the show. This show is dedicated to helping you not just survive retirement, but truly rock retirement. And that is having the confidence to rock retirement. And I had a conversation the other day with a member of the RC and friend, Dave, and he was telling me about learning to play the harmonica. And there's this whole online community that does that he just loves. And it was fascinating to me, one, because of the community, but two, how detailed. It's like learning a language, playing the harmonica. There is so much more than you would think there would be from just blowing on it or sucking on it. It's that way with a lot of different pursuits. They seem sort of, oh yeah, play the harmonica, just blow on it. You remember doing it as a kid. But then when you start to dig down to perfecting a craft, it is fascinating. From boat building to woodworking to fountain pens and notebooks, which is my passion. Speaking of notebooks, the other day I was sitting next to a friend, Wilson, and he had a notebook he was using. And I'm a fountain pen aficionado and notebook collector. I love notebooks. And he had this notebook. It's called the Standard Issue Notebook number 3, issued by DesignerWorksInc.com. Don't know who they are. Have no affiliation with them. So free advertising for them, I guess. So DesignWorksInc.com. And I'm like, Wilson, can I check out your notebook? And he gives me the notebook and it has this nice cardboard cover. As soon as I opened it, it laid flat. The pages were thick, very good for a fountain pen. I just love the whole quality of it. So I bought this one, and then I bought the project notebook, and they came in the mail, and big box. Shauna rolls her eyes at me, and I pull them out, and I spend a day with the larger one, not the number 3. I think it's a number 6. And we're sitting outside on the patio, and I'm sitting there telling her, honey, I'm holding this notebook like with reverence. I'm like, this thing is the best notebook that I've ever had. It just feels so good. It laid flat. As soon as I opened it, I'm sketching something for a course and with my fountain pen in it, sitting outside. And I'm like, this thing is just amazing. My point is, my friend Dave learned how to play the harmonica, and he's learning how to keep bees. And he thought he'd keep a beehive. And then he realized he's got, not enough land to really keep a beehive without upsetting his neighbors. But there are these solo bees and that you can keep. And they only live for like 4 weeks or something. And he started to tell me for 15 minutes about solo beekeeping. Here's the point that David made to me that I want to make to you, because there is a point. I often encounter people that are retired that they don't know how they ever had time to work because they are always pursuing creative mastery of something. It could be dancing, it could be woodworking, it could be beekeeping, it could be harmonica, that become these lifelong pursuits that they never would have dreamt they were doing or would do while they were working. How would you fit it in? You don't have time to play the harmonica when I get home. I'm just tired. I want to watch a little TV, go to bed. Well, if you're alive and you're thinking in retirement, you have a choice. First, you're going to be uncomfortable because you don't have enough to do because you had this huge schedule. And it's very easy to opt for distraction. I'll just go on the internet. I'll go watch MI5 on Amazon Prime, which has 10 seasons. They're pretty good. They're weird, but pretty good. And I can opt for distraction. I'll just watch 1, which ends up becoming watching 3, which ends up becoming hours every day. It's very easy to use this space to choose distraction. That's the easy route, actually. I struggle with it every day. But you also have the pursuit of, or the choice of, I'm sort of into harmonicas, or woodworking, or knitting, or writing, or volunteering or mentoring. And all of a sudden, you'll create this rich life that you never would have thought of because you never had time to think of those type of things. And Dave is an exemplar of that. So bravo, Dave. I love being your buddy. Thanks for sharing that. With that, let's get on with the show. Speaking of exemplars, this show is sponsored by Boomer Benefits. They do Medicare, and we've used them in our practice to refer clients to and work through making a Medicare decision based on individual situation. And they're great at navigating that. You can check them out at boomerbenefits.com/RAM. And they're great at helping someone navigate and gain the information they need to make a decision about a very important benefit that you have, Medicare. And the cool thing is you don't even pay for it because it's all built into the Medicare system, whether you use somebody like that or not. And these people are pretty awesome. So go check them out. All right, we're going to continue this series on functional health with Dr. Bobby DuBois, talking about nutrition, which is a lot of rabbit holes here to go on. So let's have that conversation with Bobby. Before we do that, briefly, I got so excited about beekeeping and harmonicas and notebooks, I forgot to mention, tomorrow, May 19th, we are opening the doors to bring in our next cohort for the Rock Retirement Club. We're having an online meetup tomorrow night, the 19th at 7 p.m. You can go to livewithroger.com if you're listening to this early. But we're going to open the clubhouse from May 19th through, I believe, let me get my calendar here, I believe until Sunday the 22nd. So we're going to bring in a group of people. The last cohort we brought in January had about 170 people, and we do a lot of special meetups and events to help everybody jumpstart creating their plan of record and answering the questions that can help give them the confidence to rock retirement. So you can check that out at livewithroger.com for the meetup tomorrow or at rockretirementclub.com. So I just want to make sure I said that because I would get yelled at if I didn't. We'd love to have you check it out. So let's go have a chat with Bobby. So this week, Bobby, we are going to talk about nutrition. And you made a comment last week when we were going to have this discussion that this is a topic where we have lots of rabbit holes we could go down, or landmines. I'm just curious why you thought that. And I agree with you, but I wanted to hear your thinking behind that.
Well, I have spent my entire career really focused on understanding what works in healthcare and then figuring out how to get doctors and patients to do it. What has always been very difficult for me is when people say, oh, this is the exact right way to handle something, and everybody should do it, and there's no evidence to support it. And this is really common in the world of nutrition. You know, what you should eat, when you should eat it, the cantaloupe diet, whatever. We'll get into some of this. So I wouldn't call them anti-science, but there's so little science and such strong emotions. That's always been difficult for me, given the scientific kind of orientation I take to all aspects of what does or doesn't work.
So let's start off, I think, in defining what do we mean by science? What is science versus faux science? I think that might be helpful to understand.
Sure. And we will begin, I think, a little bit today. And then next time when we talk about more generally what works in healthcare and how are you or a loved one best able to navigate the system and what does or doesn't work for them will become even clearer. But this is really a good place to begin. Science is a process, and I'm not a historian of science. I'm not an expert at this. Also, I should, just as a disclaimer, I'm not a nutritionist. And I am, however, a reasonably savvy consumer of evidence and have been very interested in what is or isn't true in nutrition. But I'm not a registered dietitian or anything like that. So science is a process of having a hypothesis. I think being overweight is a problem and people might die. And then doing a study that either proves or disproves it. You begin with a hypothesis, you design a study, and then you try to test that out. The problem is that oftentimes people have beautiful theories that don't necessarily connect to evidence. And we'll get into some of those beautiful theories that didn't pan out. And too much of nutrition is based on theory. Oh, we looked at your blood and look what happened. Blood sugars go up and antioxidant levels go down. And this is bad. We must do something. And they have a theory for how that would work. But then when you play it out and do a real rigorous study, very, very, very often it doesn't pan out. It doesn't actually work the way you think. And we'll go through a whole bunch of examples over the course of today and next time, so people get a rich sense of, well, what is a good study and what isn't? And unfortunately, with nutrition, most of it really isn't strong evidence. Great theories, but wouldn't be something I would tout as, yes, we found the way.
Yeah, and I think part of that is the commercial aspect of promotion plays into that. That is not necessarily it discredits things, but it has to be understood. I think of, when I was on the debate team in high school and college year, the book was called How to Lie with Statistics. And statistics are very fungible in that way. But anyway, I just wanted to have at least that framework. Now, food, let's talk about food, and that's nutrition. It definitely brings joy and satisfaction. I think that's how we generally think of food. How do you start to frame nutrition as to what's its purpose?
Well, it's a critically important topic. And I would say, even though we don't necessarily know, what's the right amount of protein to eat, how much is too much fats to eat, and some of this, and we'll get into a little more of the nitty gritty later on. We do know that obesity, overweight is bad. And there's just 50 years of data that there's really no question about it, that being overweight, and the US population, maybe we have 30 or 40% that are obese, and then almost as many that are overweight. And there's a direct correlation between being overweight, especially being obese, and heart disease and death. So there's absolutely no question. There's good science here to show that that's a problem. Where it gets a little trickier is, what is the best way to lose weight?
Well, before we go there, Bobby, I want to ask a question real quickly. When we talk about overweight, obese is a whole nother category, but when we talk about overweight, whenever I look at the published indexes, I think it's the BMI or something like that, for my height and age, am considered overweight when I look at a chart, right? I'm 5'11", I'm 55 years old, and I weigh about 209 pounds. So based on, say, a BMI index or some chart that I would find online, I'm considered overweight or on the high end of where I should be. But when I look in the mirror, and I would not call myself overweight. How do you think about it?
Well, the BMI approach is the standard approach. Is it you 25 and below, or you 25 to 30, above 30? You have to have a yardstick. Now, the yardstick may not be perfect, but if you use the same yardstick over decades and everybody seems to be moving in the wrong direction, you could say, well, Americans, they're just got muscular and how wonderful. No, you look at people and they have guts. So if you really care, and if you really think you're one of those people where the BMI is not a good measure, there's all sorts of other things you can do. There's DEXA scans and other kinds of things of truly measuring fat and those kinds of things. But for the average person, I think a BMI is not unreasonable. And most people know what their proper weight is. When I was in college, I weighed, this amount, and I've been trying to get back to that point. So yes, I think we could argue about the best way to measure it, but I think most people have a pretty good sense of whether they're, 10 pounds overweight or 30 pounds overweight, or they feel like they're actually quite right, or maybe too low in some cases.
So it's a good starting point, and then you start to look at the specific facts.
Yeah, I think so.
So what are some reasons we should focus on nutrition, especially in this season of life, right? We're not like my son who's 26 and can eat whatever he wants. And, obviously he should think about it too, but he has a metabolism and he's in a season of life where it's less evident in terms of being resilient in our nutrition. Why should we focus on nutrition, and what should we focus on?
Well, I think there are really 3 or 2.5 reasons. The first is there is the relationship potentially between what you eat and how long you live. And I would say it's not as strong a connection as people would like, because there's all sorts of examples that we'll talk about where we thought we knew the answer, but we didn't. But there is some potential relationship between what you eat and how long you live. The second is that there's a relationship between what you eat and how you eat it and your function. Now, I'm not sure that relationship is as strong as we'd like. If I eat more protein, I'm going to feel better during the day. Yeah, maybe yes, maybe no. And there are some people who are truly gluten insensitive or peanut allergic. And yeah, clearly what they eat will affect how they feel. I think most of it relates to the last feature, which is nutrition does affect your weight. And having a proper weight, you look better, you can get around easier, you're not carrying around a backpack in your middle. And that's where I think it really comes down to is having a proper weight. And as we'll get to towards the end, just a basic diet is where I think folks should focus on.
And I think a good thing about focusing on nutrition, Bobby, is, when I think about it with my life, if I think of hope, I always like to go back to hope. And the framework of hope is, one, we want an aspiring goal of a better state for ourselves in the future, functionally in this instance, right? Second, to have hope, you can't just have that goal, but you have to have agency and you have to have pathways. And when I think of functioning health, correct me if you disagree with this, there's so much that is just fortune in terms of disease and things that can come into life and injuries, that it can feel like you don't have much agency in this journey. And nutrition is one area where you have agency. I can do something here to help myself, right? I can actually control this to some extent. And there are pathways through how you manage your nutrition it's important to have agency as we age. And this is one area where we can really have agency, right?
Exactly. Yeah, genes do play an element of this, and we can talk later if you wish about how much of the story is driven by your genes. Some is, but a whole lot's not.
And one hard part with nutrition, and where I want to start with, is I remember the food pyramid. And modern thinking is that food pyramid was all wrong. So there seems to be a long history of, we thought this was right and now it's not. And I know you have shared some examples. And so that might be a good place to start as we think about nutrition. How do we know what's good and what's bad? What's the history of that?
Yeah, it's critical. And my hope for this in the podcast that comes up really is about the topic of nutrition, but it's really more deeply about how do we know what actually makes sense and there's evidence to support it, and what it might take us down a pathway that's really ruining our life in some fashion. So I'm old enough to remember when eggs were bad, shrimp was bad, lobster was even worse. And it came from a great theory, which was we knew from long studies, good studies, that high blood cholesterol was associated with premature death.
Okay.
And due to heart disease. And so it seemed logical and a good theory that you shouldn't put cholesterol in your body because then you're going to die. And maybe they did some simple studies where they gave people lots of eggs and they measured their blood lipids and maybe they went up or something. But it turns out that 95% of the cholesterol that's in your body makes it itself. It has nothing to do with what you eat. You could eat a lot, you could eat little, it's irrelevant. In fact, eating cholesterol is totally fine. Now, saturated fats, people could argue about, trans fats, most people would argue about, but cholesterol itself is not. So if you were a devotee of eggs are bad, you went down a pathway and basically took away joy in your life for no apparent reason. The same story with fats, fats are bad. Well, probably not. I mean, maybe trans fats are bad. That's probably true. But just because you have a theory doesn't make it real. Coffee is one of my favorite.
I'm drinking one right now, and I have this on the outline, and I'm like, thank God this is not true.
There was a point, maybe 40 years ago, when coffee was bad. And the typical study at the time was what we call an observational study. So they round up a whole bunch of people, they give them a questionnaire, and they say things like, how many eggs a day do you eat or a week? How many cups of coffee a day do you drink? And then they follow these people over time and they observe things that might look good, things that might look bad. So coffee was found that people who drank a lot of coffee had premature deaths. They had mortality from heart disease and other things. And they were like, okay, coffee's bad for you. And if you drink more than 3 cups, that's really bad for you. Well, it turns out that the studies were completely flawed. Now, at the time, they didn't understand that. But what happened was, it's not true today, but back in the 50s or so, people who drank coffee typically smoked. Mm-hmm. And they would have a cigarette while they had their coffee. So really what you were measuring wasn't the coffee itself, it was the cigarettes associated with drinking coffee. And the people who didn't smoke and didn't drink coffee looked better. And so we learned that observational studies have confounders, things that we didn't measure that may be causing what we observe. And that if you go down the rabbit hole of believing these things, you could be in big trouble. Another example is hormone replacement therapy.
Okay.
And in the 60s and 70s, women were told, we observed these women who were on hormone therapy and their heart disease risk went down. And tens and tens of millions of women went on hormone therapy, only to find out later that when they did a proper study, a randomized controlled trial, and we can talk about the characteristics of that, they found, in fact, that hormone therapy causes heart disease, breast cancer, and stroke. Well, more stroke and breast cancer. So it was bad for you. Now, not that nobody should be on it, but that they should understand there's a risk. So why did the studies originally get it wrong? Well, because the women who originally started hormone therapy, like the early adopters, tended to be people who read magazines that talked about it and went to their doctor regularly and were very concerned about their health. So what was really going on was that these were a healthy group of women who ended up on hormone therapy versus the women who weren't paying attention to their health, didn't go to their doctor, didn't read about things. And it's what's called a sort of healthy responder bias. And there's hundreds of examples, which of course we don't need to go through. But a lot of nutrition is built around studies that have this level of rigor associated with them and not the gold standard. And when you then hold the Atkins diet or the cantaloupe diet or the paleo diet and ask the question, did they do real studies? Or is it just great theory, some studies in mice and some studies on blood tests? The answer is most of the time, no.
It makes me think of, and I think in the nonfiction book world, to make an analogy maybe, is there's a constant theories that come out on business practices and techniques and blah, blah, blah. And they're wonderful ideas that are promoted, but generally there's a rule that some of us have of, hey, I'm not going to read books that don't stand the test of time. Rather than read everything new, I'm going to go back to what are the ones that have stood the test of time. 7 Habits for Highly Effective People as an example. It wasn't just an idea that bloomed and then shriveled, but one that has really stand the test. Sort of try to filter all of this information coming at us. So do you think that's a good rule from a nutritional standpoint?
Jumping on the bandwagon early is probably not a good idea, unless it was a really good study. But unless you end up with a good study, just standing the test of time doesn't necessarily mean anything. I mean, bloodletting
good point.
was a very popular thing to do, and leeches were a very popular thing to do, and they stood the test of time. Now, both of those went by the wayside. However, in modern medicine, there are times when leeches, in fact, are the treatment of choice. Gangrene of a toe, frostbite, those kinds of things. And bloodletting in some conditions actually is something you do. So the test of time isn't enough. The gold standard, and yes, I am a devotee of Voltaire. Let not the great be the enemy of the good. You can't just say, well, they haven't done a randomized controlled trial. I'm ignoring it. I mean, okay, let's not get too specific about it. But the ideal study, because of these confounders, the people who get a treatment may be fundamentally different than those that don't. You need to randomize people. You take 1,000 people and you say, well, I think this thing works. So 500 of you chosen at random are going to get this thing, and 500 of you aren't. And ideally, the patient and the doctor don't know which is which. So you have a placebo of some sort. And then you have an objective observer who doesn't really know whether you got the thing or you didn't get the thing, because they have a bias. The observer can have a bias. And then you see what happens. So ideally, you'd have people doing the keto diet and the paleo diet, and you'd randomize them to all these things. And then you'd follow them forward for 6 months or a year or 5 years, whatever. Actually, when you actually did some of this, the diet doesn't matter.
That makes total sense on the macro. When I think of, I'm the one that's going into this and I don't know who I am and it's my micro life, I just want what's going to work, right? And that's the messiness, I guess, of a lot of this kind of studies, right? Is it's people.
It is people, but I am not a nihilist. If you have to wait for a randomized controlled trial, we may all be dead. But there is what's called an N of 1 trial. And this was very popular decades ago, then went out of favor. Now it's back in favor to some extent. It is known if you have high blood pressure. So obviously the topic today is nutrition. So people say, oh, you have high blood pressure. You should reduce your salt intake, because we know countries that use less salt have lower hypertension rates than countries that use a lot of salt, like the American diet. But it turns out very few people are salt sensitive, meaning, the 100-year-old person that smoked all their life, didn't matter to them. But if you said nobody ever gets to smoke ever, what about those people where it actually doesn't hurt them at all? Salt is the same way. Some people are very sensitive to salt. So an N of 1 study is you test it in yourself if you have high blood pressure. You have a home blood pressure monitor, you go to the doctor periodically, and you take 6 months on a low salt diet. If it makes a difference and it works for you, great. If it doesn't, for 80% of the people, it probably won't matter. Then you need medication. Similarly, if your cholesterol levels are high, some people diet helps. Most people it doesn't. Give it a try. You are the test subject. It is real for you. If it doesn't help, then don't cut those out of your diet, because as you said at the very beginning, food and nutrition is satisfaction and joy. And we don't really punish ourselves. When we love eggs, we like salty foods, if it's not going to be a problem for us. And if it is a problem, then we need to know that.
I think this is a really important point. I think of my wife who's downstairs, and she loves when I talk about her on the show. So we'll keep her downstairs, but she'd be open about this. She has psoriatic arthritis. And over the last 2 or 3 years, she's been on this journey of experimenting. What happens when I eat gluten or when I don't? And she's been on elimination diets, but really it's more of an elimination self-study, I guess would be a better frame of when I don't do this, how do I feel? And then in trying to isolate, I'm just going to take this one thing out and see if it makes a difference. And then when I reinsert it, be aware of whether she has flares or more symptoms. And that's, I think, a little bit of what you're talking about, right? Of being a little intentional about testing yourself before you go down the medication route necessarily.
Or as an adjunct to the medication route.
Yes.
Yes.
In her case, she has a medication too.
Food diaries and associating that with symptoms are great. I mean, I wear the Oura ring, which measures all sorts of crazy things from my finger, and sleep quality is one of them. Now, is it a perfect measure of sleep quality? No. But if I drink alcohol before I go to bed and I look at my numbers for sleep, it affects my sleep and affects how I feel the next day. So I think self-examination and testing makes perfect sense, with a caveat, which is the placebo effect is really real.
Let's define what that is.
People have found that when they did studies of treatments, and for drugs, this is very common. You give a drug or you give a pill that looks like the drug and you see what happens. And if it's depression or something else, both arms of the study, people do better. And they scratch their head and say, well, I'm just giving them a sugar pill. How could that possibly make people better? Well, one theory is they were going to get better anyways, and it had nothing to do with the pills. Or you thought you were on the real treatment. And so you, because a lot of things that go on in your brain are subjective, you thought you were going to feel better, and you do. As we talk about some of the diets later on, some people find intermittent fasting. I skip breakfast every day, or I drink 6 glasses of water throughout the day. And if that works for you because it helps you reduce calories, wonderful. Maybe it's real, or maybe it's just placebo. But at the end of the day, if it works, it works. Just to be aware of it, because the last thing you want to do is go to your friend and say, well, I learned that when I cut out gluten, all problems in life were resolved. You should do the same. That's where you get into trouble, because what works for you may not work for somebody else. And it may be placebo in you, and it may not be in the other person. And so just be cautious.
That's a good point of when you start recommending it to others. First, on the placebo effect, that's actually not a bad thing. It doesn't, outside of real medical issues, it doesn't matter how you get there. If you believe it's working and it improves your quality of life, that's good, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I think we had talked about this after we chatted last, not on air. And I was using the example of I take athletic greens, which is this powder that I put in water that has this whole multivitamin nutritional stuff sourced by blah, blah, blah. And it's a monthly subscription, which a lot of things are. And honestly, I don't know if it works or not, but I feel better about myself because I take it as part of my protocols throughout the day. And the downside of it doing me any harm is nil. And other than the cost, if it doesn't do anything, it makes me feel better about myself. And if it helps me, awesome. That's sort of an example of it, right?
I think it's a perfect example. And as you correctly thought about it, what's the downside? The downside of rushing off to Mexico to try Laetrile, if you may remember from 20 or 30 years ago, people went to Mexico. It's an extract of apricot pits that they thought cured cancer. Some people thought. And they would spend lots of money and use these alternative medicine approaches. The downside there was that you avoided chemotherapy until it was way too late. So if there isn't a real downside, trying a low salt diet for 6 months to see if it helps your blood pressure, there's no downside. Trying the greens, no, great. But if there's a potential downside, just be aware that you're delaying something else that really could be effective.
And I think that's a really important point, right? Because especially in like a cancer diagnosis or something else, you want to do what is, or at least not pursue any conventional at all in favor of an experimental side, because the downside could be that, like you said, oh, this could have helped me but now it's too late. That's the opportunity cost in essence.
I think it's probably time to pivot to weight loss and having a proper weight, because that really is the elephant in the room.
Okay, let's talk about that.
So, I'm going to start to sound a little bit nihilistic, like nothing works. Actually, it's nothing works, but everything works. The good news is everything works. And the reality is that nothing works. But let me begin by sort of what I think, if you net out all the studies, and this is my opinion based upon my read, I don't think one diet's better than another for weight loss or for just about anything else. The Mediterranean diet you were talking about, does it stand the test of time? People have been talking about it for 50 years. It's eat a lot of fish, olive oil, nuts, not a lot of trans fats or other bad fats, and, throw in some red wine, whatever. That type of balanced, good diet, I think, is great. And I think there's reasonable evidence that for the vast majority of people, this is a good thing. I think there's pretty good evidence that we lose muscle mass over time, and that protein intake, by and large, probably people are getting too little protein. They probably should get maybe close to a gram per pound a day, certainly if you're trying to build muscle, and certainly close to that for most people. When you go to the market, don't go up and down the aisles. Ideally, shop around the periphery. Fruits, vegetables, meats, that stuff, I think, that's the philosophy I've done. And if you want to take a daily vitamin, great. Can't hurt. I take one just because. But the mega vitamin, that's a whole rabbit hole that I don't think has been proven. So that's the positive. I think, there are your 6-shot whatever. Be aware of what's filling your grocery cart. Is it stuff from the periphery or is it stuff from the center? It's not that the stuff in the center is bad for you. It's not like it's going to raise your cholesterol levels or whatever. What happens is it's very calorie dense. So it's very easy to eat too many calories when you're using processed foods. It's a lot harder to eat too much broccoli, even too much meat, but it's really easy to eat too much packaged macaroni and cheese.
Well, I remember in my prior business with my partners, we hired a nutritionist to come in and work with us for 2 months. And the one thing I discovered was if you're eating real food, not processed food, manufactured food, it's hard to eat a lot of real food, right? To get the calories or things that you need. You have to eat a lot more to get the same calories, which ultimately is going to make you eat less just because it's the volume that you need from, say, meat or vegetables. You have to eat so much to get the same thing you would get caloric-wise in a bag of chips.
That's right. I remember my grandmother 60 years ago saying, well, it's all about how many calories you eat. And she was a slender, stately woman, and being the proper weight and the proper person was important to her. And that was her, like, how many calories go in and how many calories you're burning. And it's not much more complicated than that. And over the decades, there's been so much focus on what you eat, when you eat it. But you know what? It probably doesn't matter. It's what I said earlier. All diets work and all diets don't work. Diets that work for people, by and large, do so because in the end, people don't eat as many calories. Some people love the keto diet, which is low carbohydrate. And they say, well, I just feel full all the time. Duh, now you're not eating as much. Some people are, as I mentioned, the 8 glasses of water. Well, I feel full all the time because I got water in my stomach. I don't eat as much. Some people are like, well, I like to have multiple small meals a day. And that's the solution. All of these are probably come down to, if you're just eating cantaloupe all day long, well, yeah, you're probably missing some nutrients. But by and large, if you're eating at least a modicum of normal stuff, it all comes down to calories. Now, yes, there are genetic aberrancies where, some people absorb a lot of calories from their food. Some people don't. Some people's basal metabolic rate is very low. Yes, that's all true. But for most people, it comes down to calories in and then exercise that burns them. Now, this is completely unscientific, and I will preface it by saying that. But I've learned that if I'm really, really hungry and I'm about to sit down to a meal, and if I had a scoop of peanut butter 15, 20 minutes before I eat, the fat in it makes me feel satiated. I just don't feel like I'm as hungry. Or if something interrupts dinner before dessert, before I get a chance to get a second helping, like I have to go outside and take care of the dogs or whatever it is, I come back 20 minutes later, I thought I was going to have more food. I don't feel full. So this is what works for me to keep my sort of calorie intake under some control. And whatever diet works for you, great. I think it's when people tout it too much for everyone that I have a problem, because there really isn't science to support it.
We have these heuristics that we create to try to make sense of things, right? Especially when they're complicated. And I've gone down these rabbit holes, probably not as scientifically as you have, but I've always come down to try to eat real food and less of it. Less food in general and real food as much. And then I'll have my chips and dip and do things on the side. But if I can stick mostly to real food and a little less of it, and I've experimented with myself. And I think this is sort of the key here, isn't it, Bobby, of just the intentionality, having some intentionality of the nutritional, what you're doing, and being aware of how you feel after certain things, after you ingest certain things, or if you eat a little late, or if you don't eat a little late, things like that.
I think it's a balance between what your body is telling you and what the science supports. Right. I mean, I can't remember. I should remember. I've seen this commercial about 4,000 times on Fox News. Those pills that you take that are packaged vegetables and fruits. I can't remember. And they're done in the dark. And, people spend real money on that stuff.
It's a huge industry.
And you have all these, what's that?
It's a huge industry.
Billions of dollars. And, if you got a lot of money, it's probably not going to hurt you. But people think that works, as if there's some studies that show, there's some theories, but there aren't randomized controlled trials. And the one that's for pain, I took this in 3-week trial and pain-free. Again, if it helps you, great, but be cautious and ask for the evidence that supports it, because you don't want to deprive yourself of stuff that you enjoy if it really isn't going to matter. You don't want to waste your money on stuff. And you don't want to avoid doing things that really could help you because you're led down the path of something that there is no science to support it. It doesn't hurt to say, what's the science? And if people look you in the eye and say, well, it is pretty skimpy, and you say to yourself, well, I'll give it a go. And if it's placebo, it's placebo. And if it's real, it's real. Well, we'll see.
I think this is sort of human nature, though, with these, those type of ads play on the human condition of we want to do better, and it's very easy, and we know internally. So there's some conflict within us that we want to do better. We want to eat better. We want to, I think of investments. We want better investments. And these ads play on that. And by purchasing that, it resolves that tension, at least on the short term. And we feel better about ourselves. Even if we only take the pills for a week, or we do something for a week. And it also, I think, helps us avoid the work, the intentionality about paying attention to your body and testing. It helps us avoid that, which is what we should be doing is the work, not in a bad sense, but paying attention to what we eat and how our body reacts and just doing little things. And I think that's the danger of some of these, I think in the investment world, these things that feel like they solve all our problems when they really don't, but it gives us that short-term feeling.
We want to feel we have some control in our lives. You called it agency. You have control over what goes in your mouth. And so it's a very powerful opportunity to feel both in control and out of control. A lot of people that eat a lot, they feel like they're out of control during that half hour where they had more ice cream than they thought they should. It's a really, really important and tough issue, which I don't think we should minimize. And the fact that we have obesity that's high is a reason we need to help people as well as we can, both emotionally supporting them and with the science that could help us. And my plea, of course, not to the people on this podcast, but more broadly, is that we do a lot more rigorous studies on nutrition so that we will know what does or doesn't work and help people. Surgery for obesity got a bad rap. I mean, yeah, in the early days, it was a big deal. But for people who are truly, truly overweight, obese, it can be a godsend. And we need to support people as this is an opportunity, something to consider, because there actually is science that these type of things can help people.
Now, next week, we're going to talk about navigating and having agency to make better decisions. But for today, what are some takeaways from a nutritional standpoint that can be heuristics that we can just start to think about as we walk our own journey?
Well, step one is humility, that we don't know as much as we really should know. And so we should take whatever we do, pun intended, with a grain of salt. There is no question that obesity is a big issue and that trying to focus on being relatively close to a proper weight is real and important and a million ways to try it, and admittedly with relatively little science to support it. I think a balanced diet, just like you talked about, is a great way to go. And just be somewhat of a skeptical person when it comes to hearing claims, that you ask about what the science and the evidence is that underlies it and begin to be a more critical thinker about that. It's an important topic. I wish I had more do A, B, C, and D, but if I did that, then I would be going beyond the science. And so I'm cautious. And so I'm telling you what anecdotes work for me. And I'm telling you the high-level things that I think science supports. And beyond that, we don't know.
And one thing we didn't hit on, I appreciate that humility and knowing what you know and not going beyond that, because that is not a common trait in public forums for whatever reason. Now, next week, we're going to talk about how to navigate and create a framework for thinking through some of this stuff in terms of exercise and nutrition and also healthcare. And you have some frameworks that you've shared with me that I'm excited to talk about. And I think we'll end this conversation with, always got to remember the point, right? We talk about longevity, right, Bobby? But a lot of this is, and we didn't really hit it on nutrition, it's about energy and energy management, right? We want to live long, but we also want a lot of life in our lives, the ability to have the energy, the capacity to do all the things that we aspire to, right? So we'll have to make sure we talk a little bit about that next week.
Sounds good.
All right, buddy. Thanks for the insights.
My pleasure.
All right, well, let's get to some of your listener questions, which we want to make sure we answer a few of them every week, and sometimes we'll focus on these. If you have a question for the show, you can go to rogerwhitney.com/Ask Roger. I feel particularly alive today, and hopefully I'm not talking too fast. I'm just having a good day, I guess. All right, so our first question comes from Brian in regards to Social Security WIP. What? Windfall Elimination Program, WEP. So Bobby has a question about Social Security and the Windfall Elimination Program because his wife, after teaching for 20 years in Ohio, so she's part of the Ohio State Teachers Retirement System, STRS. You'll know it if you're part of it. So she receives a pension there, but she also worked part-time over the years in private jobs, which means that she qualifies for Social Security. And when you are part of these. Generally, it's going to be a profession in the federal, state, or local government in a system where you don't pay into Social Security as part of the employment. So there's no FICA taxes taken out, but you do get some pension. So a lot of these municipal or federal programs, you opt out of Social Security and you have this pension. And what can happen is, just for general clarification, that you have these part-time jobs or you have a job later on where you do qualify for Social Security and potentially could qualify to quote unquote more benefits than are fair. And that's what the WEP tries to reconcile. And so we have to, if you're a member of these government pension schemes, you got to have an understanding, am I subject to this windfall elimination program? And how do those interact? And this can get about as clear as, well, better than mud, but as clear as murky water, because it can be very technical. So you want to have a good tax advisor or somebody that understands this stuff. So for some context here, there are about 6% of all workers that aren't paying into the Social Security system. And about 3% of all Social Security beneficiaries are affected by this windfall elimination program. So you're in an elite group, Brian and wife. And so the way that they interact is that there's a formula based on the years paid in that will reduce what you're allowed to get as a primary insurance amount for Social Security. And this is a generic formula. So Brian, this isn't going to be specific to your situation and the sequencing of years that your wife was under each system. It's just a generic formula. And you're correct that your spousal benefit from the person that is subject to the WEP is based on the reduced primary insurance amount as well. So from a spousal benefit, it can be impacted greatly. Now, there is a little bit of good news is that the Social Security widower or widower's benefit, if you outlive your wife, in this case, Brian, will be recalculated without the WEP penalty. So I hope that helps explain somewhat how they interact without getting too technical, but this is definitely some place where you want to get an expert to look at your situation so you can figure out the choices on these things as you're planning your own retirement. So our next question is actually some perspective from a good friend of mine. So let's listen to this and have a quick discussion about it.
Hey, Roger, Dan Miller here, longtime listener, big fan. Recently, you had a listener ask if there was such a thing as retirement regret. And I want to assure you that I see it everywhere. I spoke with a gentleman just recently who retired at 52 because he had enough money to do so. Now, he was clearly kind of proud of the fact that he was able to do that, but he hates the life that he's living now and is very envious of my life at 74, where I get up every morning with a whole list of things that I want to do to engage with people and do work that's meaningful to me. You know, we're told that people deteriorate pretty quickly if they don't have friends, money, or purpose. But I want to confirm that having no purpose will destroy a person much quicker than having no money. So yes, retirement regret is very real. And I commend you for continuing to help your listeners understand what a truly great life can be. No matter what their age, no matter what their financial status, it's more than just a mathematical formula.
Wow. I love Dan Miller. So let me give you some background on Dan Miller if you're not familiar with him. He is a New York Times best-selling author, wrote a number of books. 48 Days to the Work You Love is his most known work and really the ecosystem of Dan Miller's life. And I'm actually walk life with Dan every week with about 15 or so other people and have for years. We have weekly calls where we help each other and encourage each other. And so I would consider him a really good friend. And I think Dan Miller, and he has a podcast, 48 Days to the Work You Love, been doing it for years. He's the GOAT when it comes to that kind of stuff. Great podcast. And at 40 or 74 years old, and I know his wife Joanne very well, they are my exemplars, to go back to that word, of how I want to be in the future. I would love to be like Dan Miller when I'm 74, to have that passion and that energy and that excitement about life. They're the exemplars, he and Joanne, of what I would love my marriage to look like when I'm in my 70s with my wife, Shauna. So he knows of what he speaks. And Dan, I thank you so much for sharing that perspective. Perhaps we'll have to have you on the show. He's been on the show a number of times, so you can look at our archives and hear Dan Miller and I have chats. But thanks, Dan, for sharing that and encouraging all of us. Hey, money is important. It's the fuel that sort of paves the way, but it's not our life. So thanks, buddy. All right, let's get to one more question. And this is going to feel like a big left turn after Dan's comments, but it's an important question I wanted to make sure I got to. And this is from Doug. I'm just going to read what he shared because I hadn't prepared for this and really condensed it. Greeting, Rogers. I've been listening several years and really enjoy listening to your podcast on the way home from work. I am 56 and have analyzed retirement 9 ways to Sunday for my wife and I. We will have an inflation-adjusted pension with 50% survivor benefits as well as health insurance for both. Great tailwind there, Doug. In a twist of fate, while checking off my routine health exams prior to retirement, I was accidentally discovered to have a cancerous mass that needs to be removed. Ironically, during the first week of retirement, I guess it's good that we'll have plenty of recovery time. Yeah, you will. This particular cancer leaves me with about a 50% chance of a 10-year survival. So not too bad, but not great either. This, of course, has resulted in my reanalyzing our finances and running through the scenarios of if I die early. My wife hasn't had a great interest in the details of finance, so that needs to change. So at least she is comfortable with how to possibly continue on without me, perhaps earlier than planned. She wants me to prepare a death manual to help guide her on things financial, bills, insurance, etc. My question for you is, can you recommend any resources to help facilitate that process? Well, you have a specific question, Doug, and I'll definitely answer that. But just some big hugs going out to you on this, and be careful when you look at those statistics too. Retain your agency of what can you do to improve your survivability and thriving and rocking retirement. Don't get too caught up in statistics. Always come back to what can I do? And I think you know that. I'm guessing you got that spirit to begin with, but just want to send and I have no doubt everybody that's listening, well wishes. Now, what do we do in terms of helping your wife pick up the baton financially when you pass? So there's a couple different things that come to mind here, Doug. Number one is, what are actual resources to help you build this quote unquote death book? 2 I think of right off the top of my head. I had to scan my bookshelf. I try to have a very well-tended bookshelves without a lot of clutter. The problem is I have so many amazing books that have to be on there sometimes. Maybe I need to organize them. But first thing that comes to mind is it's an AARP publication by Sally Balch Herm, H-U-R-M-E, called Checklist for My Family, a guide to my history, financial plans, and final wishes. And it's literally a book. I am holding it in my hand right now that walks you through with places to complete all the information. So you could use the actual book as the thing of here's the manual, the death book. So that would be one resource, Checklist for My Family, AARP publication. The second one I would suggest is Everplans. This is actually, it's an online version, I think, of this checklist that works a little bit like a TurboTax. It allows you to, it'll interview you and based on your answers and collect all the information to put into place for the survivor, and including, if you so desire, uploading the documents so you don't have to wonder where they are. Everplans is, I think it's about $80 a year as a subscription. If you're a member of the Rock Retirement Club, it's a free benefit. So it is included in your subscription price, just FYI. And it can help guide that. So those are the 2 resources I think of. The third thing I would think of is, as you're building this, my suggestion would be is don't build it and give it to her. Have her participate in creating it together. This is going to do a couple things. One is it's going to help you slow down, and as you're teaching it and explaining things to her, because she's not the financial manager in this situation, it'll help you slow down and make sure you're communicating clearly, and it will help her be part of the process in order to ask follow-up questions to flush it out. So the more she owns this manual, as you call it, the better. because then she'll understand it. If you just create it, she's going to have to decipher what you've written after the fact. So do this as a joint process. And I would make it put the cancer stuff aside. That is the spark that is motivating you on this, Doug. Put that aside during this process. This is something that in an ideal world, you should do anyway. So don't make this about, I have cancer, we have to do this. Just use the spark to do it together, regardless of who dies first. It should be organized. And as best you can, make this a series of little wins. Maybe you complete a chapter a week where you both have action items, and you create it in a structure like an agile project where you have all these little small wins and you celebrate all those little small wins so you can not make this a chore. Make this something you're doing together. You know it's good stewardship, and it's going to put you both in a great spot. I think that's a great way to structure this so you can take this lemon that has sparked you, and I'm sorry about that lemon, and create some lemonade so you can make it a more joyful experience, okay? One common thing I see is when there is one spouse that is very engaged and active and one that isn't, is that in situations like these, and I've walked this journey all the way to the end, is many times the engaged spouse, where let's say you don't have an advisor or people that you use in your life because you just always done it. Well, it may make sense, or something to consider, is starting to build a few relationships with a financial planner or an advisor without the intent necessarily of going and using them right now, but with the intent that you want to have you want to vet them and have some relational currency built up with you and them and your spouse and them. It has to be somebody they like, somebody that they feel comfortable with. It might be good to do that even if you're not going to move everything right now. So she has someone to turn to perhaps be the project manager in this instance, if that's not her spirit, because that will help you help her in having someone that can manage the process and be that confidant when the time comes. That could be a financial advisor. It could be a tax advisor. I know one actually divorced person that uses their CPA as sort of their conciliatory. I don't know how you pronounce that. Nicole will tell me, the advisor to the Dom. But that would be something to consider as well, Doug. So I wish you the best on your journey. Doesn't mean you can't rock retirement. Rock what you got, buddy. And I hope you're well. All right, let's go set a SMART sprint.
On your marks, get set.
And we're off to set a little baby step we can take in the next 7 days to not just rock retirement, but rock life, which is the point. All right, in the next 7 days, start down the journey using the framework that Bobby outlined right at the end of our chat. Let's just start with that little journey and keep it simple. Use guiding light principles and don't feel you have to go down the rabbit hole of nutritional studies or programs. Keep it simple. Most things are. We'd love to have you check out the Rock Retirement Club at rockretirementclub.com or our online meetup tomorrow. We're opening enrollment for a cohort. And the kind of questions that we mash out and the topics we mash out on this show is what we go deeper in together in the clubhouse. So if you're interested in having healthy conversations that are two-way and world-class education without some sales pitch, check out rockretirementclub.com. And with that, hey, go rock today, okay? Today's the day. Hey, it's time for that all-important disclaimer. We so appreciate you listening to the show and love your questions and love the teaching that we're able to provide here. And actually, it helps us too. But remember, you're not our clients.
Not love it if you took advice from us on the show.
We would not love it if you took advice from us on the show. Realize this is helpful in education. Talk to your legal advisor, your tax advisor, or your financial advisor before you make any decisions.
We appreciate you joining us today for this episode of Retirement Answer Man. Be sure to visit rogerwhitney.com/answers to access the Retirement Answer Library with over 30 checklists to help you make the most of the only life you have. Remember, you have more power than you realize to create an amazing life starting today with Retirement Answer Man. opinions voiced in this material are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. All performance referenced is historical and no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested into directly. Have a wonderful day.